Even as the Second World War was still being fought, there were many German soldiers who were being dragged to gallows inside of the Soviet Union to their executions. For Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, public executions were used as a way of showing his population that the German enemy, who had committed terrible crimes following the launching of Operation Barbarossa, were being dealt with. It was a propaganda tool, and it made Stalin's popularity increase. A number of trials were held in the Soviet Union, in which captured prisoners of war were brought in front of judges, and these German officers were accused of being involved in the slaughter of civilians, burning of villages, and mistreating women. Many of the executions of these German soldiers were performed and done in public to ensure that the Soviet people saw a glimpse of justice being carried out, but they were done on huge gallows structures where many were executed at the same time. In this short documentary and compilation video, we look at the different sets of executions carried out inside the Soviet Union and the stories of those German men who were left swinging on the gallows. Please note that as this is a compilation, there may be some information that is slightly repeated. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Operation Barbarossa was launched by the German army on the 22nd of June 1941, and it was the largest land offensive in history, with 10 million soldiers taking part. No one would have anticipated that Hitler would launch an invasion on the Soviet Union to begin with, as he actually signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, and the pair had agreed not to fight each other for allegedly a decade. But this was then broken, as Hitler's whole belief was to rampage to the east, and he wanted to destroy communism. But during the course of Operation Barbarossa, 3.8 million Axis soldiers entered the Western Soviet Union along a front of around 3,000 kilometres, and they were supported by 600,000 vehicles and more than 600,000 horses. This opened up the Eastern Front, which became the bloodiest theatre of the Second World War, and saw some of the biggest battles in history. But the crimes that the Nazis and the Germans committed inside of the Soviet Union were endless. For example, the Nazis would starve to death and deliberately kill over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, and millions of civilians died from starvation and mass food shortages. But following the German army was a paramilitary death squad known as the Einsatzgruppen. These were soldiers who were there to round up civilians and execute them. The Einsatzgruppen's crimes were horrific, and they would force many to dig their own graves before they were then shot in these pits, and still many of their crimes have not been uncovered, and their victims still lie under the ground. Further horror occurred as the German army would abuse civilians, and they would burn and raze settlements to the ground, as well as loot whenever they could. Hitler had specifically given orders for commissars to be shot immediately without trial, and mass killings occurred every single day. The citizens of Leningrad were subjected to a hard and rough ordeal during the Second World War, as they would experience a siege that lasted 872 days, and with this over 1 million people would starve to death. Around 400,000 of these victims were children younger than 14, and the German and Finnish blockade of the city cut off food supplies, fuel, and materials and rations sunk to a very low amount. There was hardly any food to go around, and the Soviet civilians were forced to eat pets, and others resulted allegedly to cannibalism. There were 2,000 people arrested for eating human flesh during the siege. There was a huge amount of suffering, and Leningrad became the site of the most lethal siege in the whole of history. The city had also suffered from German bombardment from the skies, as bombers would rain down on the city, and thousands would be killed by the German bombs. Artillery bombardment also hit the city, and the city was in complete ruins. The siege was eventually lifted, but Leningrad was scarred with the horror of what had happened. The sentiment of those who witnessed what had happened inside of Leningrad led to the belief that those Germans were completely evil, and after the war there was a significant amount of reprisal wanted against those enemies of the Soviets. But at the end of the war, Leningrad became the site where 8 German soldiers who had committed crimes inside of the Soviet Union were executed in the square. 11 Germans were tried in this trial, which occurred inside of Leningrad, and most of them had committed crimes in the Pskov region. It's not known specifically why the Germans were collected in this group, and why they were then taken to Leningrad for their trial. it may have been a propaganda effort because of the horror that occurred in the city during the war. 8 of these men were then sentenced to death. The most senior of those condemned was Major General Heinrich Remlinger, who would during the war order 14 expeditions of German soldiers who would rampage in the Pskov region and would burn villages down. He was linked to the slaughter of 8,000 people, mostly women and children, and documents discovered linked him to this as well, as witness testimony did. His soldiers shot over 200 people in Karamyshevo, and 200 more were burned alive in wooden buildings in Utogosh. The horrors of Remlinger's troops were many more. Another condemned man was Captain Sturafin Karl, who shot 25 people in the Osterhof region. He ordered his men to shoot children and young boys with machine guns, and he was known for shooting 200 people with his own weapons himself. Oberfeldwebel Engel Fritz was part of the platoon that would burn 7 villages, and these men shot 80 people and burned 100 houses and sheds, and the horrors of Fritz's actions were told to the courtroom. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Böhm was found guilty of burning villages down, such as Krivets, Olkahova, and others, in which around 60 were shot dead, and Böhm shot 6 people himself. Lieutenant Eduard Sonnenfeld went on the rampage from December 1943 to February 1944, and he burned villages with his men. In Zapolia, his men killed 40, and in another village named Seglitsky, Sonnenfeld's men ordered civilians to dig trenches. They then forced them in, as his men threw grenades into the trenches. Sonnenfeld took part in executions, and the court reached a conclusion that he himself had killed around 200 Soviet civilians with his own hand and weapon. Janika Gergard was a soldier and was not of any particular rank. Was in the village of Malyaluzi. 88 civilians, mostly women, were driven into a barn and were then burned, and Gergard was linked to personally slaughtering over 300 people. Soldier Erwin Ernst was also involved in burning villages, and he killed 100, mostly women and children. The final man who was condemned for his crimes, also known as Erwin, was involved in the executions of 150 people, and in Luga he burned 50 homes, and was then involved in burning other villages and around 200 houses. Those German soldiers and officers were seen by the Soviets after the Second World War as the ultimate evil, especially following the experiences of those who had lived through the Leningrad siege. Their trial was covered by the Leningrad press, and newspapers each day documented what happened. But as mentioned, those men were sentenced to death, and a gallows had been created in Leningrad, on the square, near to a market. The crowds on the 5th of January 1946 gathered near to the gallows for the executions of the German soldiers, and to those who would witness the executions, it was in a sense justified. They had seen how the Germans treated the Soviet civilians firsthand, and they knew the horrors that had occurred. These were people who had been shot at constantly by artillery fire and had been bombed by aircraft of the Luftwaffe, but they were there to see reprisal and revenge. The crowd was large, and the Germans were brought out. Each of them were paraded in front of the crowd, and they did remain calm in their final moments. But General Heinrich Remlinger was not as calm, and he looked for a way out, but there was not one, and he went to his execution not as calm as the others. If he would have broke from the executioners, and it's possible, he would have been torn to pieces by the Leningrad population. There was no sympathy for these men, and the executioner and the officials then announced the crimes of each of them. What struck some was that these were men who had slaughtered many. Many of those slaughtered were women and children. The Germans had been loaded onto the backs of vehicles and lorries, which were then reversed under the gallows inside of the square. Each one had the noose tied around their necks, and when all of the men had been secured to the gallows, the vehicles then slowly drove off. This led to the Germans now swinging from the gallows in the air, and they were left hanging until they were then killed. After the crowds left, the Soviet Guard was there to protect the remains, and some boys threw ice at the executed bodies, but the Guard did nothing to prevent this. The witnesses did not cheer, but there was in a sense justification and revenge for the German soldiers who were executed that day. The city of Leningrad suffered heavily during the Second World War, and the civilians in the city who died during the siege numbered around 1.5 million, but there was a huge death toll also for the Red Army and the German forces. It was one of the bloodiest events of the Second World War, and the levels that the people of the city had to sink to during the siege to survive led to many believing that after the end of the war, that executions against German soldiers and officers were completely justified. These men who were executed were not involved in the siege, they were not involved in the attacks on the city, but they were involved in attacks against Soviet civilians and villages in regions hundreds of miles away. To those civilians of Leningrad, all of these men were evil, and there is no doubt that their actions were horrific, and that their actions led to the slaughter of innocent people. But the deaths of those Germans on the scaffold in the centre of Leningrad were seen by some as a small reprisal for the horrors that they had personally experienced. Belarus would be fully occupied by the German military, and it had been ruled for 20 months before by the Soviets, and the Germans invaded, and the country would then suffer heavily. There were bloody battles in which cities were encircled and civilians suffered, and during the early days of the occupation, a Soviet partisan movement came around. Partisans would hide around in the woods and swamps, and they inflicted a lot of damage to German supply lines, and they would blow up railway tracks, bridges, and other infrastructure used by the Axis soldiers. They also ambushed German soldiers, and during one attack, 4 German trains carrying Tiger tanks were destroyed, and the Germans had to also fight partisan activities, as well as the Soviets. But there were a huge amount of war crimes carried out by the German army, and there were 380,000 people deported for slave labour from Belarus, and hundreds of thousands were executed. The Germans wanted to exterminate the complete Slavic population, and over 9,000 settlements were burned and destroyed in Belarus. Ghettos were then set up, and one was established inside of Minsk. The ghetto here housed 100,000 Jews, and inside of here the conditions were terrible, and the Germans would slaughter and execute at different times. A second ghetto would be created, and here every night around 70 people were executed when they got there from other countries and lands. Jews were forced to work in factories or other German-run industry, and in March 1942 the Nazis liquidated a nursery and orphanage. It was said of this horrific event in Minsk that, at that moment, several SS officers, among them Wilhelm Kerber, arrived, whereupon Kerber, immaculate in his uniform, threw handfuls of sweets to the shrieking children. All the children then perished in the sand. There were pits where thousands of Jews were executed and killed, and the ghetto was liquidated on the 21st of October 1943, with most of the inhabitants then being sent to the Sobibor extermination camp. But at the end of the Second World War, a series of war crimes trials were held in the city and in various cities around the Soviet Union and in different lands to punish Nazi war criminals. The Minsk trials took place in 1946 in the capital of Soviet Belarus, and those brought to trial were members of the German military and SS officials who had caused chaos inside of the country. 18 men were placed on trial and were accused of crimes committed during the occupation of Belarus, and this included 11 members of the Wehrmacht, including 2 Wehrmacht generals, 4 members of the Nazi police, a police general, and 3 members of the Waffen-SS and SD. Johann Georg Rickert was a German general who commanded the 286th Security Division and also the 35th Infantry Division. His soldiers conducted operations against partisans, and Rickert ordered that all of his own soldiers who were in hospital without injury or diagnosed illness were to be executed, and he was a brute who threatened other commanding officers. He would force around 40,000 civilians into a death camp, and the establishment of this camp was said to have been one of the worst crimes the Wehrmacht ever committed against civilians. He was one of those brought to trial, alongside Gottfried von Erdmannsdorf, another general who commanded the Ordnungspolizei in the Minsk region. General Erdmannsdorf established Fortress Mogilev and held this position, but he was accused of the deportations of 10,000 people, destructions of villages, schools and churches. He was also linked to the shootings of disabled people during the constructions of fortifications, and the use of people as human shields. He was also accused of the establishment of camps where people were sent to. Eberhard Herf was the commander of the Police Regiment North and Order Police units in Minsk. He would encourage and order the mass murder in the Army Group North area, and then became the commander of the Order Police in Minsk, where he was in control of the mass murder of Jews in the ghetto there. He became a general in the Order Police, and it was said he eventually wanted to get out of the East as he had had enough. But he was responsible for the executions of thousands. Also brought to the Minsk trial were George Robert Weissling, commander of the 26th SS Police Regiment, Ernst August Falk, battalion commander in the 26th SS Police Regiment, Reinhard George Moll, the local commander of the Babrusk, Karl Lentz, the commander of a POW camp, Hans Hermann Koch, chief of the SIPO, and an Einsatzgruppe officer, Rolf Bouchard, special commander in Babruysk, August Bittner, Sonderführer, and chief of the farm slave labourers, Bruno Goetzer, commander, Paul Eick, a deputy commander, Bruno Mittmann, a soldier in Minsk, Franz Hess, a Sonderkommando member, Heinz Fischer, an SS cavalry corporal, Hans Höchel, a Wehrmacht private, along with Alois Hetterich and Albert Rodenbusch, two other Wehrmacht privates. Inside of the courtroom, all of the men were accused of crimes against humanity. They were all convicted of the horrors carried out in Belarus. But 14 of those were sentenced to death, and their executions would be carried out inside of a horse racing venue in Minsk. The three generals were all condemned, and to the people of Minsk, who had suffered greatly under German occupation, these men were evil. They had seen their friends and family members slaughtered and executed, with many being sent to concentration camps. And these trials in Minsk were considered like the Nuremberg trials. But on the 30th of January 1946, those men who had been condemned to death in the Minsk trials were brought out to their executions. A huge gallows site had been created in the horse racing venue in Minsk, which was known as the Hippodrome. 100,000 civilians had gathered to see the executions of those men who had been sentenced to death. They were brought out one by one to the gallows. On the gallows, a number of nooses had been placed, and then the men were placed on a vehicle, and the noose was then tied around their necks before the vehicle was then pulled off, and each of the men were left there dangling and hanging. 14 of them were hanging from the gallows at the same time, and to the people of Minsk who had suffered greatly, these executions of these men were completely justified. The German soldiers of Minsk were all condemned for the mass slaughter they had participated in across Belarus and the Soviet Union. They had been involved in the executions of civilians and the deportations of thousands to concentration and extermination campsites, where they were then killed when they arrived. The country suffered heavily under German occupation, and the Nazis caused chaos there. But some of those executed were military generals, and these were high-ranking members of the military that rubbed shoulders with Hitler. Kharkov as a city had been occupied in late October 1941, and the Germans had rounded up thousands of civilians, including Soviet prisoners of war, and they had been executed by the Einsatzgruppen death squads. In fact, during one day, on the 15th of December 1941, 15,000 people from the city had been exterminated in a mass shooting in Drobetskaya. There were also gas fans and hangings used against the civilians, and there were often bodies strung up from lampposts in the city as the Germans struck terror into the hearts of the civilians. The Gestapo inside of Kharkov also shot 435 patients who were being treated inside of a local hospital. They did not discriminate by age, and in this particular war crime, they shot old men, women, and also children who were seeking medical help. But then as the war continued, the occupation of the city became much tougher, and in March 1943, there were 800 Red Army soldiers in the city who were being treated for their wounds, and these were then shot or burned alive by the German authorities. It was claimed about the actions in this region that the German fascist invaders had shot, hanged, burned alive, and poisoned by carbon monoxide gas more than 30,000 peaceful, completely innocent civilians, including women, old people, and children. Hitler and his military generals had given the men a free rein to do whatever they pleased inside of many Soviet cities, but there would be fierce fighting in 1943 around Kharkov as the Soviet Red Army tried to push the Germans out. It was retaken by the Soviets in February 1943 before a counter-offensive was launched by the Wehrmacht, and they then recaptured Kharkov in April. But the city would then be liberated once and for all by the Soviets in August 1943. Kharkov had been completely devastated, and the Soviets had discovered scores of mass graves in the city. But to bring some form of retribution and a sense of justice to those civilians living there was a war crimes trial arranged against 4 men who were said to have been responsible for much of the terror. One of these 4 was a Soviet collaborator who had worked with the Nazis, and the other 3 were Germans. These men were just 4 of those who were put to the sword by the Soviets in reprisal, and they were all charged in participating in the extermination and murder of Soviet civilians, with the collaborator, Mikhail Bulanov, being charged also with treason. It was a military court, and there was a significant amount of testimony gathered against the men. Shockingly, the 4 of them all pleaded guilty, and it's not known if this plea was obtained through torture or duress, but they all admitted to the crimes, and they would describe what happened in detail. The men were accused of using gas vans, exterminating people, and murdering them also through gunshot and other means. Wilhelm Langheld was one of the defendants, and he admitted to slaughtering 100 Soviet civilians, and it was found that he ordered the shootings and took part in them. Hans Ritz also was involved in directing the shootings, which were carried out by an SD death squad based at Taganrog, and it was claimed that he battered the victims with weapons before their executions, and he tried to get information from them, torturing them. Reinhard Retzlaff was also a torturer, and he had allegedly ripped out the hairs of his victims and had then stabbed them with needles to get information, presumably about the Soviet Red Army's movements or the partisan resistance group's activities in the area. It was claimed that he also drove the victims into the gas vans and was involved in the burning of the bodies of these people. Mikhail Bulanov was the Soviet man accused of collaboration and treason, and he was also found to have betrayed the Soviet Union and sided with the enemy. He was a chauffeur who worked for the local Gestapo officer, and he allegedly took part in the use of gas vans, and he also took part in the shooting of 60 children. The Soviet military court wanted to put these 4 men to death for their crimes. The court proceedings are, it's considered, rather sketchy, and it is most likely that these men were of course war criminals, but their executions would be carried out as a powerful piece of vengeance propaganda for the Soviet people and Stalin, who had been suffering for some time. The prosecution stated, Teutonic Knights of the Great Eastern Expanse, who daily and hourly carried out Hitler's orders without feeling good feelings and pity, destroyed civilians, and were proud of their cruelty, considering them subhumanly worthy only of mass destruction. It was also said that the men had carried out the everyday killings and executions. The evidence that emerged and the information about the war crimes brought a significant amount of terror to the courtroom, and they were all condemned to death for their crimes. In particular, the fate of Bulanov left a bad taste in the mouth of many Soviet people, as he had betrayed the motherland and sided with the Nazi enemy, becoming a cog in their deadly mass murder machine. The Soviets would not take long to carry out the executions of the 4 men, and the day after their death sentence had been handed out, the executions were performed. Inside of the city of Kharkov, there were 4 gallows structures that were quickly created for the executions overnight. Each of these had a large central beam in the sky, probably 4 meters high, and they then had a crossbeam attached, and another piece of wood, creating a triangle to make them more sturdy. There was no execution scaffold or platform made, and on the 19th of December 1943, the 4 men were taken out into the city of Kharkov for their executions on these gallows. Thousands of people had been gathered in the square around the execution structures to witness the deaths. There were 4 executioners who passed a rope over the gallows structure, and the men were driven up to the gallows on the back of a truck, with these acting as the platform for the condemned to stand on whilst the noose was secured. With the nooses attached around the necks of the condemned, the trucks then drove off, leaving the 4 men swinging on the gallows suspended high in the air, slowly strangling to death. One eyewitness who saw the proceedings that day claimed, "It was all over in a few moments." The defendants were hoisted onto the back of 4 open trucks and stood on stools. Then the nooses were looped around their necks. There was no blindfolding. During the preliminaries, 3 of the 4 prisoners had to be propped up. Bulanov had fainted, Ritz and Retzlaff had turned pasty white. They drawled at their mouths and their knees gave way. Only Langheld, the old soldier, remained stiff as a ramrod throughout, never once flinching. Once the nooses had been adjusted, at a signal the trucks pulled away, and the 4 were left dangling and kicking in midair. The execution of the 4 men that day inside of the city of Kharkov was some reprisal for the suffering that the people had been placed under with the German occupation. Let's remember that these executions were carried out in 1943, 2 years before the war would come to an end, meaning that the Soviets were bringing military charges and tribunal against captured POWs who were accused of shocking crimes even whilst the war was still going on. These executions that were carried out inside of Soviet cities and towns had a profound effect on the people, and it also helped to boost the power of Stalin, and his reputation was enhanced as the executions were seen as him, wielding his iron fist upon the brutality of the German enemy. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.